Hello and welcome to IronAge Media. We'll be talking to Razorfist today, a man of many interests and talents, who in recent years has taken on writing the Nightvale series. We'll be discussing it with him at length, along with a number of other Iron Age topics, which I'm sure that you'll enjoy. If you find yourself interested in buying the Long Moonlight or Death Mask, they'll be linked in the description, along with a number of other places to find Razorfist's content in case you've been living under a rock. Enjoy. All right, Razor, I'm very glad to have you here today. Can you tell everybody, in the random chance that somebody doesn't know who you are, can you give us a real quick intro to who you are and what you're doing?
Yes, I am Kaiser Sose. Uh, no, I am Razorfist. I am a commentator and sometimes backup dancer for Run DMC. I have a YouTube channel. I draw. I write. I do lots and lots and lots of things. I don't limit myself.
Yeah, that's one thing that I've enjoyed about you over the past couple years, following your various works here and there, is that I'm really never quite sure what you're gonna get up to next. Um,
That's pretty much the idea. Whatever whatever the hell I really feel like doing is pretty much the order of the day.
yeah, I am specifically wanting to talk to you about your latest endeavors as an author, your Nightvale series. So, going back on that, when did you start writing? I know that you said you started at a fairly young age thinking about this world, but when did you get into writing?
Well, yeah, I first came up with the idea for not even the world. It wasn't the world that I came up with. It was another story entirely. Nightvale is essentially a spin-off of a series that I never published. That's basically it. It was going to be a proper low fantasy sort of epic. It was going to be a diptych, so split into two different parts. And rather than a trilogy, even then I was tired of trilogies. So, and I did write a book and a half of it. I mean, I almost finished it, but then I wanted to go back. I got the bug where you want to go back and do a new draft, and that whole, which was one of the reasons Nightvale was so cathartic, because years later, this is when I was about 10 years old that I wrote this.
Yeah.
And whatever, years later, always in the back of my mind, I had the idea ever since I was a little kid I loved Robin Hood and, stuff like that. I've always loved the roguish kind of bandit-like characters, even the thiefy sort of Conan stories.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to sort of channel that. I had this idea of, okay, this world is getting bigger and bigger and more detailed. And so what if I took this huge world with all this history, 2,000 years of history that I had written out, and then just went way close, grabbed that magnifying glass and went as tight and as low level as you possibly could get, down to the street level. I want to see what a street corner is like in this world. And in the back of my mind, it was like Thief. Thief is it is a thief story. And mind you, this is before Thief the Dark Project had come out, the video game. So it was more like a Robin Hood kind of an idea.
Yeah.
And then when I got older and sort of codified my love of, noir and pulps and things like that, I got more and more enamored with the idea of doing a street level crime story.
Mm-hmm.
In this sort of, like, I'd always wondered, watching Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings or even reading Tolkien, thinking like, what would like beat cops of Minas Tirith be like? Right,
Yeah.
right? Like, because it seems like the world is so detailed, and yet you don't get this sense in Tolkien that people live here day to day. It's very much an epic, sweeping kind of. So I've always loved the low fantasy side of things. I've always loved the pulpy side of things, the sword and sorcery side. So basically, I just mixed my two loves: sword and sorcery pulps and noir pulps, and then combine them together in a package. Of course, when I got a little older, I got into the Thief games too, and they were inspired by noir as well. So there's a lot of crossover there. And so really combining all of these things that I really loved into the very first story, The Long Moonlight, which was received really well. But if the first book was more noir, then I knew every single volume, like any good pulp, needed to be generally in the same oeuvre, but it
Yeah.
needed to sort of do something different every single time. So first one, a little bit more noir. Second one, I knew, okay, we're fantasy noir. Next one needs to be a little bit more fantasy. So that's what I've done. Keeping the thick Raymond Chandler-esque patter and atmospherics of noir, but really moving into leaning more into the sword and sorcery inspirations of the setting at the same time. So that's really what it is. And it's in that classic setting of sword and sandal, windswept deserts and stuff, basically where I live.
Yeah.
So I steered into it. I actually wrote very heavily from life experience, in fact, in the desert.
Were you, I'm going to say, so is that like a confession that there are actually trimmers like, large sand snakes and things out in Arizona that we need to be careful of?
Well, that's the thing. They're more like land leviathans
Yeah.
in Death Mask, which was, I've never been a big Dune fan, really.
Mm-hmm.
So they were never intended to be like Sandworm. The idea was they were, well, I don't want to give anything away in the book, but the idea, the suggestion, the legend that people, the rumors that swirl are the idea that these leviathans had come over from this massive cataclysm, whether it was a tsunami or an earthquake or a combination of both, and somehow, instead of dying, whether because the cataclysm was brought about magically or through some kind of arcane craft, instead of dying and suffocating out in the middle of the desert, somehow managed to adapt and become the alpha predator in this sort of inhospitable environment. And the idea of like what would happen if like a whale managed to learn how to walk on land. So that was sort of the idea behind the wind serpents in there.
Yeah. Bringing it back to the main character for both of these stories, Xerxes.
Yeah.
He's obviously drawn from a lot of different sources, but what would you say your biggest inspirations for Xerxes himself was?
Really, Robin Hood and Philip Marlowe are probably the biggest. Yeah, because really he's a detective in every single way except for his vocation. Right? I didn't want to do the standard because you get a lot of, I'm going to do a fantasy noir. And then it's, hey, we're wearing trench coats in a cobblestone medieval street and we've got steampunk revolvers. And blah. You know what I mean? It's like they watch Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid and they think that's what noir is.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, noir is an atmosphere. Noir is a style of patter. It's a style of dialogue. And an expressionistic and romantic approach to the subject of crime, right? Mm-hmm. So really, it was more important to me that Xerxes, the main character, fit the sort of function in terms of story that a Private Eye. Private Eyes are chosen for a reason, right? Dashiell Hammett, his stories were semi-autobiographical because he used to work for the Pinkerton Agency, and he's sort of the originator of all of it. But thereafter, Private Eyes became very utilitarian for noir writers of the pulp era because if you think about it, you're dealing with a crime story. So you have two major factions that are always at war. It's cops and robbers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, who can straddle the line between those two?
Exactly.
Who can be wherever the story is taking place? It's going to be a Private Eye. In the context of my world, there are no private eyes, and it doesn't make sense for there to be private eyes. There could be maybe investigators that are hired or something, mercenaries, but it didn't make a whole lot of sense. A thief can kind of straddle both areas because thieves have to work as informants. They have to know who all the fences are. They're gonna know the cops in this world, and I do call them the slang cops sometimes as a stylistic sort of embellishment. But at the same time, they're thieves. So they can get really heavily embroiled in, the darker, more violent side of whatever gangdom, the underworld.
Yeah. Well, and I have a good friend of mine has worked as a private investigator. And usually people don't hire private investigators because they want to find something out. What they want is they want punish somebody that they already think is guilty. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So in that sense, a thief is perfect you know what I mean? A perfect analog, because
Yeah.
he's going to go out and get what they think they're owed. So,
Well, it's similar. I mean, it's if you read the Marlowe stories, or even some of the stuff by Hammett or W.R. Burnett, even James M. Cain, where the characters aren't even private detectives.
mm-hmm.
There's a lot of intrusion, voyeurism. There's a lot of picking locks and eavesdropping on people. And there's a lot of that in noir. So it sort of is part and parcel of the whole thief milieu. It always worked. And then the fact that growing up, anytime I was playing a fantasy game, anytime it was an RPG time, I was always the thief. Fuck rogues, by the way. Stupid class. But it's a thief, goddammit. So give me a thief or an assassin any day over a rogue. So I always loved that and was enamored with Robin Hood. And so that all those things kind of played in together. And then, of course, Xerxes was a character who was there from the very beginning, but he was a background character. That was another thing. People who think that I was inspired by one thing or another don't realize Xerxes is a background character for one of the main characters in the novels that I didn't publish. Mm-hmm. So he's just a name on a page, right? That he was part of the Wolf Pack. This is stuff we learn in the Long Moonlight. And he and one other person managed to survive the betrayal of the Wolf Pack and whoever sold them out. And so he and the other person are obviously, suspect number 1 and 2 on who could have possibly ratted them out. So he kind of has this ambiguous air about him. The people in his own strata don't really trust him, but neither do the authorities because he didn't necessarily work with them and so forth. So it's, that's kind of where that comes from.
Interesting. So that kind of brings me along to another question that I had related to the novels, which is, one of the things I like about Nightvale, the Nightvale series, particularly I feel like Long Moonlight, just because it's a little bit lower on the fantasy scale and a little bit more narrow in scope, is that this isn't a story about saving the entire world from an impending, demon army or whatever, have you. With these original novels, were they more grand in scope? And you decided to kind of extract these little stories?
Only politically. They were actually, it's funny, they were more Game of Thrones-ish, and Game of Thrones wasn't out yet. Mm-hmm. The idea, I had grown up with BattleTech and stuff. Yes. I was already a big fan of BattleTech at that point. So my idea was, let's set this in a fantasy environment. I know, wildly original idea. Hope nobody steals it. So the idea was more about the political machinations and sort of the overarching war. And I had put these different, and you get this a little bit of background on this even in the Long Moonlight. Little references to, the sort of all the different major powers of the land of Vale being sort of in opposition and in this sort of unsteady stalemate. Menuvia is not a main place in that story. It's an also ran, but it is important in the sense that it houses the Senate, and the Senate is sort of ceremonial, but they're trying to take back their power. They're sort of in cold revolt right now. There's a very charismatic senator who's sort of ascending at the time, and they're talking about reconstituting the military of the Senate, which would be an act of rebellion, things like that. There's little references to that aren't like thrown in your face, because I've never liked that kind of storytelling where it's you throw a lore encyclopedia at them. And speaking of which, you get a lore encyclopedia in Deathmask. No. You guys asked for it. I wouldn't have put it in there otherwise.
Well, it's one thing to include it at the end or something. It's another thing to be like, and now we shall interject a paragraph of history.
Which I've never written that way. I would much rather, I think it is way better, personally, if you have a choice between the reader knowing way too much and being totally clueless. You're way better off with the latter. Way better off with the latter, because then at least they have to draw their own conclusions. and now
Yeah.
they're an active participant. Now you can bog them down in too much shit that you haven't explained. Like that's a problem, right?
Yeah, if they don't
But
understand what's going on at all. Yeah, yeah.
if they don't know exactly what's going on at all times, it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
They'll figure it out. You know what I mean? Like that's never bothered me particularly.
Interesting. So, I was, well, we'll pivot to kind of like writing style questions, because I had a couple for those, and I've watched some of your streams and I've seen super chats come in with, questions for how to write and where'd you learn, and what kind of influence you have. Is there anything, like, what would you say your biggest gripe is with like modern literature, if you've really read much these days?
Modern literature, I mean, there are things that I like about more modern genre fiction and
Mm-hmm.
things that I dislike. I don't like that it's like, if I were to go to a major fantasy publisher and I were to be like, all right, so I got a real direct story. It's very plot driven.
Mm-hmm.
I got kind of an interesting character, but it's really more about the story that I'm going to tell, sort of an interesting world, whatever. It's like, I don't know, it's 200 pages. It's pretty good stuff. You guys interested? They'll be like, awesome. Add 300 pages to it until it's a doorstop. And we're going to get some Luis Royo digital art knockoff to do the cover that'll look far too shiny for some reason. And then we're good to go. Then we can do something with it. It's formulaic. That's really what I don't particularly care for. What I do like about modern genre fiction is the chapters have gotten shorter. I hate long, boring I hate chapters where I need to break out a bookmark. If your chapter's so long, I need a bookmark, I'm already losing interest. That's just my short attention span, though. That's why I like pulp. I like the shorter, more direct chapters, and I try to write that way, right? Like the longer chapters in the Long Moonlight were at the beginning when I still thought I was writing a novel instead of a pulp. It gets shorter and shorter, and I carried that pace into Death Mask. I think Death Mask, like the end of the Long Moonlight and the beginning of Death Mask, are pretty much the ideal pace as far as I would like. But I do like that modern genre fiction has gotten away from longer, more indulgent chapters. I do like that.
Yeah, I think that there's I saw somebody, and I think it's been said elsewhere, but readers don't care as much about length as they care about pacing. And whenever you have the shorter chapters, you have a lot more like a need to actually keep things moving. So
yeah, I will say though, you can go overboard.
Sure,
I was reading that utter bubbling turd that James Patterson wrote of The Shadow, the reboot, and it's like a page chapter, one after another. Like the longest chapter in the book is like 4 pages. It's unbelievable. The book is like this thick. It's got 50 something pages, something chapters. Actually, I think it's even higher than that. It's like something in the 60s wild. Or 70s in terms of chapters. And it doesn't move particularly well. It's like, okay, you probably could have broken up some of this.
Yeah, ridiculous. That's crazy. I haven't even looked at the thing, to be honest with you. I knew that it existed simply because of your your comments on it, but
desist. Do not.
I'll purge it from my mind.
Right.
Okay, so I'm curious about your. I went back and got the audiobooks for The Long Moonlight and Death Mask, and I just re-listened to them real quickly, and I was kind of struck by some of the changes that you made between the two books. Mainly, I would say probably in the pacing, definitely things start kind of evening out and speeding up there. So like what would you say that like were your biggest changes and learning moments from The Long Moonlight to Death Mask?
The biggest I mean, I wouldn't say there was a change. I would say that like I alluded to earlier, the tail end of The Long Moonlight just flowed. Like every chapter wrote itself. It was I knew exactly where I was going. I had outlined the shit out of it. I outlined my stories like crazy.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in a very detailed outline. And a strong, every single chapter needs that strong lead in and strong outro. Every single one. If you're ending on inaction, you've kind of failed. In my eyes, you've either disseminated an important plot point and baited the hook for future peril, or you've ended on peril or something like that. And so by the end of the Long Moonlight, I'd pretty much gotten that. The first 2 chapters of the Long Moonlight were slower because I thought that I was, again, I just started writing, right? I didn't know where I was going with the Long Moonlight. So I figured, I guess I'm writing a book. So that they were longer chapters. I think I got to like chapter 2, 3, and I let my girlfriend at the time read it. And she was big into pulp. She actually got me into pulps, and years and years ago. And she read over it, and her feedback to me was pretty edifying. It was, this is so action packed. And I hadn't thought to myself, there's lots of action in this. I'll write lots of action. And then I kind of realized, you know what? This kind of dovetails into the pulps and stuff that I'm getting into anyways. I'm not writing a novel. I'm writing a pulp. Holy shit. That's what this is. So the pace from like chapter 4 on, and especially towards the end of that book, is just, I knew exactly the blocks that needed to be laid down, and I just followed them. So Death Mask, I was often running. Like, there was no expectation in that book that I was going to linger over much on any one thing. I knew exactly what, and it also helped. The Long Moonlight was more based on kind of a reimagining and reinvention of an existing kind of concept that's been copied and reinterpreted and whatever by a number of different creators. And it's the Dashiell Hammett noir pulp, Red Harvest. Okay. Simple story of a, sort of a private investigator guy who comes into a corrupt town. 2 different factions are warring against each other. He plays both against the middle and, whatever. And of course, Akira Kurosawa ripped that off for Yojimbo, and then Fistful of Dollars ripped off Yojimbo, and now it's like a whole genre, right? Yeah. A whole bunch of people have ripped it off. I loved the idea. Like, I always liked that idea, playing one side off the other, but I liked it more when I was like, it makes more sense if this was actually a dyed-in-the-dung criminal type, because they try and portray some of these characters that way. Shouldn't he like shack up with one of these factions? What would happen if he actually got in bed with one of the factions and chose a side? That would turn out 1,000 times worse than what happens in Fistful of Dollars or whatever. Yeah. So from that basic nugget, I was off and running. Death Mask, I didn't have to. It came to me literally it's based on a dream, right? I saw it as vividly as I can see you now. I was like it was one of those half awake, half asleep kind of dreams where you're sort of about to fall asleep. And I saw the entire scenario, right? I saw the dead citadel and the sweeping deserts, and I saw it flooded, that whole thing. I pretty much, I wanted to go to sleep because actually I'd been up all night writing. It was like early in the morning by this point. When I'm writing, by the way, I have the hours of a crime-fighting vampire. So the last thing I wanted to do was jolt up in bed and write out an outline, but I had to. I was like, fine. I grabbed my phone. It was the best I could do, and hammered out a whole outline. Basically had Death Mask written before the Long Moonlight was done. Really? So the pacing was natural. I just carried forward the exact same pacing from the end of the Long Moonlight into Death Mask, and that's it. I will say, if I did anything, I probably laid on the noir patter and atmosphere thicker than in the Long Moonlight, because the Long Moonlight was such an obvious urban crime story that it didn't need the compensation. I didn't have to steer into it as much. I could almost steer more into the fantasy in that book, because the reader wouldn't be expecting it. Whereas with Death Mask, they were sort of expecting more sword and sorcery. Exactly. So I had to steer more in the other direction and give it more. And some of the dialogue in Death Mask I was really satisfied with because it had more of that kind of noir pentameter to it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's kind of what I was alluding to a certain degree, which is that I felt like there was definitely a shift in gears in that there's magic obviously in both books, but I felt like the magic was playing. There's a lot more fantasy elements in Death Mask in terms of just like raw, like numbers of things that occur within the story without giving too much away. But yeah, like you said, you steered almost away from it, even though it was present. You didn't dwell on it.
Style, yeah, it kind of reminds me of when people ask what film noir is, and when I reduce it down to its elements, I say it is a crime movie that is shot like a horror film, right? It's sort of like that. It was basically, I had to take that same approach with writing. It was a fantasy story that was written like a noir. Whereas the first one was a crime story, a noir story that was written more like a fantasy. It's like, it's all about the filter you kind of write these things through. But I felt like it had to be thickened up a little bit in terms of the atmosphere in the second book, just to keep the tone consistent. You know what I mean? So it didn't feel like a different series.
Yeah, it could easily have drifted well into feeling more fantasy, standard fantasy. And I never felt that way. Speaking,
I'm glad.
Yeah, I was going to say, speaking of the magic, you've stated before on other places that magic is, kind of this force of chaos in is it the world of Vale or the country of Vale? Actually,
it's elucidated in the lore, but it's the continent is called Travinas in sort of Manish, in English, whatever. It's just the Westerlands. That's the whole continent. It's a whole continent. Okay. Vale is the centermost and currently prevailing of the major powers. It's where humans live for the most part. They live all over the continent, but it's where their sort of dominion is centered. And so Nightvale is a reference to that, right? Nightvale is sort of the in-universe term for the underworld in that sort of world. So yeah, that's literally where that comes from.
Okay, I was gonna say I haven't done as much research as I should have. But the magic system, I was gonna ask you about that, and if there's how did you settle on a less formulaic system of magic, and what was your reasons for doing that?
Because, and I've said this before, it's like, magic, I hear the word magic and I think the unknowable, the unfathomable, the uncontrollable. Modern fantasy writers, and by modern I mean going to anybody really in the post-Tolkien, post-Moorcock kind of that whole vein, the genre fiction, the D&D, post D&D really, has kind of turned it into, and then I mix this in my alembic, and then if I add 2 granules of humpback meat, then I can, you know what I mean? It's like they've reduced it to a science, and could there be anything more anathema to the concept of magic than science? I can understand if you want to play with it in a literary context. People, the groundlings once saw science as some form of magic or whatever. We don't. Science is seen as procedural and whatever. That's what they've reduced magic to. They've taken the magic out of magic. They've reduced it to like a theorem or a list. It's a fucking grocery list is really what it is. When you break it down, how it works in a lot of fantasy, a lot of fantasy video games. Man, I wanted magic where when you cast a spell, unless you were really experienced and you made all the right pacts with all the right demonic entities, you didn't know if you were going to cast a fireball or drop a continent into the ocean. You didn't know. That's the rumor of what may have happened in the Cataclysm and Nazgûl. Nazgûl, it's not a coincidence. This particular story, Death Mask, takes place in Nazgûl, the most arid. It's basically a wasteland kind of country. this is also happens to be the place where the most kind of it's where all of the rogue mages, after basically magic was outlawed in the continent, it's where they all fled to ply their trade, because it's so arid, it's so remote, nobody's going to go search there. And the capital, which used to be held by men, is now held by a hostile regime. So they're sort of hostile to Vale, so it's a good place to hide, basically. Not a coincidence that this ruined landscape has, the most mages probably per capita.
So, as far as magic is concerned in the world, is it a fairly common? I got the sense that it's not exactly like street corner, go down and get your eyeglasses repaired or something because they broke, but and there's several magical objects in Nightvale in particular, well, in both books. But, was there an era of like more abundant magic, or is this kind of a post magic era, or has it always been rare?
It's always been viewed with skepticism, because magic in the world of Vale, in the Nightvale setting, whatever, on the continent throughout its history, has been seen and has frequently proven itself a chaotic force. The entire weather pattern of one of the nations on the continent is forever and irreparably changed as a result of magic gone awry, right? The Aviari, the most magically inclined of the people, or at least at one time they were, they at one point in their earliest, the Dawnlight Empire, had originally, been much more in communion with magic. They kind of have a caste system, and one of the castes of their society is still very much in tune with arcane forces. And for that reason, they are very much distrusted and reviled among their own. There's kind of a secularized, whatever. So, but that's among the Aviari, who are cloistered and keep to themselves. Among humans, nobody believes it exists. Yeah. Nobody believes it exists. So it literally is that obscure. And of course, several years before, they had basically witch trials to get rid of mages because of their destructive consequences. And even when that happened, the public still didn't believe it. It was kind of like election conspiracy, like how people view election conspiracies now. Some people, even with proof in front of them, refuse to believe it, right? It kind of is to that level. It also helps that the primary sort of purveyors of magic in the setting are the Beholden, who are as much kind of a secret society and a keeper of those secrets, right? They're sort of sentinels of magic because of how chaotic and destructive it is. They're also kind of recorders of history and such. They had to be broken. This is all in sort of the postscript of Death Mask, if you want to read about this stuff. But it's all kind of background. But like the Beholden kind of, they kept having too many mages go rogue. And so because of the destructive consequences of that, the Beholden were finally broken up, which actually has made the problem worse because now there's only rogue mages, essentially. And so now you're starting to get full-blown necromancy and such happening in various cities.
So as far as the future of the series, like, should we expect to see Xerxes again? And is he likely going to be visiting some of these other countries and interacting with more of these non-human species?
I mean, I work from premise of story first. So I already know at least two different stories that I'm working on, one of which is, well underway, the other of which is completely outlined. And yeah, I work from kind of the core idea of what the story is that I want to tell. And we'll definitely see different places. We'll the next, if the first story was a little more noir, second story a little more sword and sorcery, that I hold rather with the Walter Gibson kind of theorem of writing shadow pulps, where every single you kind of have different formulae, and then you cycle through them.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd have globe-trotting adventures with the Shadow. He'd have more noir adventures with the Shadow, supervillain adventures, whatever. And then you'd kind of get to the end and you would rotate it again so that you could kind of reinvent and perfect these ideas, actually. So the next one the next couple that I'm working on, one is a little bit more of a serial killer kind of murder mystery kind of thing. And the other one is a little bit of pure. It's a little, I don't know how to describe it except to say that it's a little more philosophical. It's dealing with slightly more philosophical ideas. But the story, I wouldn't say, is like a treatise on philosophy. It's more of a mystery and an action mystery, if anything. But it's dealing with, there's a little bit more ideas at play in that one.
Well, that sounds cool. I'm looking forward to finding out more about that. With the now, I know that you've recently announced something with George Alexopoulos, but as far as the series relates to Vale and Nightvale, are those likely to stay in a written format, kind of a pulp format, or do you envision any other kind of mediums that you might dabble in?
I definitely think that they'll go to other media. In fact, there may or may not be some projects, some irons in the fire that are being worked on there. I'm not opposed to doing a comic book adaptation of anything. Again, I got into comic. It's funny. I've just kind of teased this comic book project that I'm working on with George Alexopoulos, but I started in comics as an artist, not as a writer, right? Writing is a fairly recent preoccupation by comparison, but I love collaborating with people, especially a great artist like George. So I may even wind up drawing a Nightvale some kind of comic. I've been published, right? Like I actually do, believe it or not, I do know what I'm doing. So that would be kind of interesting, or collaborating with someone who has a cool style to do something like that. You might even, I've been thinking too about doing little short snippets, even comic book snippets in one anthology magazine or another, just as like teasers for other things. Might even wind up doing that with the next comic project, which I can at least reveal as a Western.
Yeah. And we don't have to go into too much detail on that, but I just was curious.
Really, I was going to break down the plot point by plot point.
But no, I just was curious if you were looked beyond pulp. So also, as far as Vale is concerned, do you envision like other characters? I mean, you said that Xerxes is basically a side character, is how he got his start.
Which was the point. Yeah, which was the point. I should have mentioned that. That was why I picked him, because he was the whole experiment of Nightvale was, let's zoom in on the most obscure, inconsequential, not having anything to do with the plot person imaginable. Okay, here's a name on a piece of paper, right? That's literally what Xerxes was. He was tabula rasa. I had drawn him before. I kind of knew who he would be somehow, even long before I wrote the story in a weird way. And the character I pretty much envisioned wound up on the page. But yeah, like that's the whole idea behind it. I should have mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, no. But my curiosity is, do you plan on going back and drawing any more characters from that original story?
What do you mean? Oh, you mean like, can characters recur?
Well,
yeah, absolutely.
Not only recur, but also just like, okay, you've sort of explored Xerxes here. Would you start exploring other characters from that original kind of more, history that you have that are totally independent of Xerxes, shall we say?
Yeah. Well, let me just say, there's already, so even before I came up, so I was 10 when I first came up with the setting and wrote the novels that weren't published, but created the world as a result of writing those novels. I was early teens, maybe junior high-ish, when I had the idea like definitively hammered out, where it was like, you know what? I'm way less interested in this full-blown fantasy novel stuff than I am in street level. Like, I had the idea for this thiefy kind of fantasy saga thing in the back of my mind. But even before I came up with that, I had an idea with a really interesting twist for a barbarian fantasy set in that world, a full-blown Conan style, but with a really original kind of twist to it, that I've had in my back pocket for a long time. I know the story. It's every time I go back to it, it gets a little bit stronger. That's been something that I've wanted to do for a while. And that is set in the same world, slightly different time period in the same setting, a little bit earlier, but set down in Yornoth, where it's a Horand barbarian fantasy sort of epic down in the snow, in the snowy tundras. So
Interesting. All right. Well, I was curious about that. So, going back to the original story, you said that it was kind of became more of a political history to a certain degree. Obviously you've had a lot of political commentary as that's been a big factor for you. How, have you had any difficulty in separating politics from writing, or do you feel like you've integrated to a certain degree?
No, not really. I mean, I've never included them. Politics to me are in universe. Like, they don't. You'll have resonances, right? Things that inspire you in one way or another. For example, the idea of the Avon Society being more caste based, where it's not about your blood or your lineage or what your heraldry, like it is kind of in the West. More, it's about your occupation and your vocation, and that sort of like they are kind of stacked on top of each other in a tiered manner, right? That's one of the most fascinating things about like when I started learning about the Edo period in Japan, right? That was an inspiration for that, but it wasn't having the aviary in the story structured that same way, or in a slightly derivative and different way. It was not a commentary on it. It was just sort of something that I found interesting and sort of novel and wanted to explore in a fantasy setting, and wanted to use as an empirical basis to build something else off of, right? So I've never really, I hate to fly into the J.R.R. Tolkien screed about I detest allegory and all of its manifestations.
Yeah.
Don't mind my best friend C.S. Lewis writing perhaps the most noteworthy allegory of all time. Sorry, buddy. Anyway, but, like, I'm not going to do that, but I don't write allegory. Like, I don't. My books don't have that kind of political commentary in them. What they will probably have, and that is unavoidable, is some manner of my personal just outlook and philosophy on life, some of that. But I try not to write my characters as me. There's a moment there's a moment at the end of Death Mask where Xerxes, I deliberately gave him like, because for 2 novels, the whole thing with Xerxes is that he's the inverse. Like, when people compare him to like Garrett from Thief, he's really the inverse. Garrett is like he's just a flat out thief shitbag who keeps getting drawn into doing heroic things, and he doesn't like to, right? He goes back to being a criminal right after. Xerxes is the complete opposite. He's number one, he's really young. He's a lot younger than Garrett is. But number 2, he's a hero, and he cannot accept that fact, right? He's completely in denial of it. So over the course of 2 books, he's basically been suppressing his every noble and historic and chivalrous instinct. And at some point, he's avoided making value judgments on any of it, because he knows that way lies the land of morality and actually having to have your own personal morals and standards. And he can't do that. as a thief in that world, you couldn't very well do that. And so I gave him this kind of moment where all this shit had happened and everyone he had met on this adventure had proven duplicitous in some way. It was just a backstab symphony to that point. And he finally just blows up and lets them know what he thinks of this entire situation and world, and gives a value judgment on the society in which he has now found himself in. And it was completely in his voice, not mine, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it was exactly how he would see it, not me. I'd have a hell of a lot to say about fucking the governmental structure of a society that has enshrined assassination and thievery into, written law and such. I wanted to have kind of that moment be a moment of character development. You see this way too often in modern writers, where you listen to two different characters talk, and you could just, if you took their names away, you wouldn't know what character it is. Mm-hmm. Like it's just the author talking. That's it. Joss Whedon is one of the worst with this, right? All of his characters. It's like, wait, should I write snarky blonde teenager today or snarky male 20-something today? With his dialogue suffused with pop culture references. So, like, I don't insert those kind of politics mainly because I want to be able to differentiate voice of character, and I don't want that to corrupt this thing. That's what upset me so much about the failed cancellation attempt of the first book. It was just they were trying to cancel the book because of my politics, and it's like, my politics could not have less to do with this particular setting, and this is something I wrote before I was even politically aware. Right? It's just absurd.
Yeah. So I was going to say, as far as the cancellation attempt, that ended up working out very positively for you overall. I mean, at least in the long run, I feel like it did. So.
Oh yeah. I wound up selling way more books than I would have. And because I wasn't tied down to, an at best inconstant publisher, who I didn't realize didn't fully support the work. I mean, the people that I was communicating with did, but other factions within the company did not. Because of that, I was able to actually profit more as a result of that. And it wound up being a greater success because of that. So it's sort of succeeded in spite of every attempt to shit can it.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I don't even know if I necessarily knew that you were getting published at the time whenever I heard about it. But since then, have you had any, significant trouble with deplatforming or anything like that related to the books?
I mean, no more than everyone else.
Yeah, fair enough.
No, I haven't. Look, you can go into Barnes & Noble right now and buy my books if you want. It's not a problem. But that's because of my publisher. My publisher's good. I was able to jump over to a publisher who actually had a better distribution apparatus than the previous one, right? So, and I think that previous publisher now is mired in court, copyright, some kind of thing. They were licensing stuff. I don't know. I don't want to speak out of school, but so they've got their own. That probably would have been a problem down the road anyways. They almost saved me from myself in a way. Because I was such a neophyte, I still am at publishing and writing, that I didn't know like what a good deal was and who has good distribution and whatnot. That is still something I do still have to learn. Is I'm not good at marketing my own stuff. I don't know how much is too much. I don't know when to make videos about the new stuff that I have out or how to do it. I'm still sort of learning as I go on that one.
Yeah, well, that it's been to arrogantly talk about myself for a little bit here. I mean, the whole IronAge Media thing has been. I mean, I don't know what I'm doing. You know what I mean? I'm just making a website, and it is. At various points I've had thoughts of like, oh, people, authors and creators and consumers would like this or they'd like that. And it's like, well, usually what I'm thinking about is, well, this is what I think people need. And it's very hard to know, until you've like dunked yourself into the chaos, it's very difficult to have any idea what it's
Yeah.
really like. And so, distribution though, right now a lot of stuff hinges on like Amazon, for example.
Yep.
And, I'm very wary of that being a sustained source of, you know, whether it be revenue or distribution or anything like that. And
Yeah.
I think, one of the things that we're going to have to figure out whether it, it's just like, not necessarily, I don't even want to call it right wing. It's just like non-mainstream media of
Just
any kind.
non-avowedly
Yes.
ideological, shrieking wokeness like that. Merely doing that as a revolutionary act at
Yeah,
this
apparently
point.
so. But uh, yeah, establishing distribution models and resources for any of that is going to be something that I think is going to eventually become critical over the next, 5 years for sure.
Fortunately, there are people who are further along on that than some realize.
Yeah.
Even I forget what the particulars of, so I don't want to say out of school, but I know that even with my publisher, with their connections in the publishing industry, they've had access to some of the same kind of fulfillment and distribution services as Amazon. In fact, they literally inherited some of the earlier systems and stuff from Amazon. So it's like it's actually something that is doable. And if a few
It
different
really
forks
is.
in the road, if a few different forks in the road had been taken, we could have gotten on this a lot earlier. I still think the main issues that are afflicting any kind of Iron Age or resurgent movement or whatever. I mean, look, the movement's here. It's not going away. All I did
Hmm.
was give a name to it. It was clearly something, there was clearly a zeitgeist brewing, anyways, because whenever you have an unfulfilled need in the market, it's going to satisfy itself. It's going to find a way, right? It's
Exactly.
going to find a way. The question is if somebody's actually there prepared to benefit from it, and hopefully everyone else can accrue benefit from them accruing benefit of it. And that's the thing. Like, this is, I feel like when I did the first video talking about where I dropped the Iron Age name, pardon, when I dropped the first video, with mentioning the Iron Age, I feel like that was way less important than the second video, where I made clear, even more important than everyone rallying to the call and making their own creations. I mean, it's great if people have creations, but people have always had creations, many of
Hmm.
which are wildly original and interesting and have cool takes and whatever. It is so much more important to have an organized group of people who are talking about it, critics and reviewers and websites that are covering it and forums and someplace for people to that is 1,000 times more important than 20 different people announcing that they're working on books. Because where are you going to sell it? Who's going to find out about it? Who's going to, right? I have a megaphone because I have a channel, right? I can hawk my wares
Yeah.
wherever I so please. But everyone else isn't going to have that benefit. And I want them to have that benefit because that's how you get a zeitgeist going. It's
Exactly.
not just if I succeed or Eric July succeeds, both of which we have, right? It's not just if Ethan Van Sciver succeeds, which he has. It's whether or not you can turn that into like a distribution model. And now lots of people can benefit from it. I feel like the beginnings of that are starting. I also feel like a lot of people in the space are not that adept at recognizing that the framework is already sort of starting to fall in there.
Hmm.
Because I'm seeing little bits of it. Look, Eric July didn't just announce ISOM #1. He announced the launch of the Ripaverse. He's
Yes.
building a whole company around that. And he's not the only one. I think if one or two big things change in that sort of vein, you pretty quickly you could find yourself with a proper way for people to communicate, to get these projects across, and become more and more passionate and on fire. Like, here's the thing. if a bunch of people announce projects, it's like they're just heralding the call of announcing projects. Here's when you get a real movement. When people who are obsessed about a particular thing that's happening, whether it was in the early 80s with tape trading with heavy metal or whatever, or any movement, the old underground comic zines and pulp zines back in the day, it's when people in that space start being so inspired by the coverage of that and sharing their passion for that, that they can't help it anymore. They have to write, they have to draw. That is when you have a movement, because you're going to get better projects that way. People creating in a vacuum isn't going to avail anyone but the few who actually are going to be successes, just because the law of averages is what it is.
Yeah, and I felt like, well, there's a couple things that I've been thinking, and one is that, yeah, like you said, it's a lot about having enough fans, enough of an ecosystem, for lack of a better word, surrounding the space, that people are able to like kind of collaborate, and that enthusiasm builds and people start doing more and more exciting stuff. But, you know, also part of it is, you know, as you get volume, you might actually be able to have more people making a living doing this kind of thing, you know?
Yeah.
And that's very important. People talk about, one of the recurring things that I see people ask about the most is like, okay, well, all right, it's great that Long Moonlight's out. That's super cool. I enjoyed it. And I liked Death Mask, but when's the next one? When's the next one? When's the next one? You know what I mean? Or with ISOM #1. And, you know, these things take time to start up and get moving, but
yeah. Well, and it's annoying too, because we're talking about distribution.
I mean,
The
it's
only
difficult.
reason, yeah, the only reason Death Mask didn't come tumbling right after the Long Moonlight, because it was written when the Long Moonlight was finished, was because we had to get it all together. I had to deal with all the publishing foibles and delays, and the guy who handled the actual binding of the books had like a nervous breakdown. And this is a professional company that I'm working. This is an actual proper publisher with, you know, shacked up with a big distribution system. This kind of stuff happens all the time.
Yep.
So you never know. And when you're dealing with all this stuff yourself, yeah, some of those problems get streamlined away. Some do not. You get a whole host of new ones that you have to deal with. I'm about to learn that hard lesson, because it looks like with the comic project we're working on, we're at least in the beginning going to kind of do it ourselves with the fulfillment, at least in the beginning. Probably to keep it in print in the long run, I'm thinking we'll go through some kind of publisher.
Yeah.
But initially, we're gonna try a slightly more DIY approach, and depending on the volume, I don't know if that'll be good or bad. I have no idea. But George is more experienced on that than I am, so I am deferring to his judgment.
Yeah. And it's kind of one of those things where, I mean, power to, and I'm a big believer in like decentralization of all sorts of different things, whether it be, you know, like whatever, but decentralization of manufacturing is something that's really come into existence in the past, you know, 20 years, like in a big way. And, you know, it's well and good for indies to have these, have the ability to do everything in house. But I also think that, yeah, at a certain point in time, you hit the volume and you go, is your time best utilized doing X, Y, or Z? You know what I mean? And so I think that hopefully one of the things that will come out of the IronAge is like a new set of vendors and whatnot that help support creators as well. And that's something that I'm trying to do, you know, is like, all right, well, just send in your short story, you know what I mean? And we'll get it figured out. We'll get some art done for it, and we'll put it in Anvil, you know what I mean? And
yeah,
I think as more and more people start doing those kinds of things, I'm seeing more and more magazines pop up. And to me, that's a great thing, because it allows authors and artists to spend more time doing what they're best at. And, you know, kind of the support network starts strengthening itself. So hopefully it all goes well.
Yeah, I think so. I like the idea of the IronAge magazine. I think it's freaking rad, and I'm
well,
I'm really excited to see what happens. What's up?
I said I'm really happy to hear that. So
Yeah, no, I'm stoked about it. I'm gonna shill it.
Oh, all right. Well, I will definitely take that, and
Right.
uh, I'll take all the shilling I can get at this point in time.
Right, exactly. No, I dig it. I dig it. He's a fantastic pitcher.
There
No,
you go.
I really, I'm excited about the concept. It kind of has a, I don't know, heavy metal kind of
Well, heavy
vibe, like
metal.
heavy metal magazine vibe to
Yeah,
it.
heavy metal was one of the inspirations. I actually went in and I went to Barnes and Noble and I was like, oh man, I need to like see what is actually being published now because I have like old magazines, you know what I mean, but I haven't like looked at a new magazine in a while, and
Mhm.
it's certainly not off the shelf
Neither
of
is anyone else.
exactly not off the shelves of Barnes and Noble, and I saw heavy metal. I was like, my God, I thought this I thought this had gone under,
I'll
and
give it a few minutes.
right, yeah, and I was looking at it. I was like, I mean, I don't know. That's one thing. The comic world is just it really is incredible how far down the drain some of these things have gone.
Yeah.
Um,
A self-inflicted wound in
oh,
most
oh
cases.
yeah,
Uh, and it's crazy because you see everyone who future-proofed themselves, manga and European comics, thriving.
mm-hmm.
Everyone who saw that the future of comics was in graphic novel form and in volumes, they're all doing great.
Mm-hmm.
And American comics who drug their feet, who refused to get with the times, even when they, for Christ's sake, Stan Lee warned Marvel Comics in the late 70s when Metal Hurlant came around. This is the future of comics. If you don't catch up to this, you're going to die. And they said, fine, get Stan to shut up. Give him this epic thing. We'll just do this epic thing. And they didn't promote it. They just wanted him to go away. And surprisingly, a bunch of the epic stuff actually did really well. Some
Mm-hmm.
didn't. Epic Illustrated was never a huge hit. It was like their attempt to sort of ape heavy metal, but it was not as committal an effort or whatever. But Stan Lee knew that this change needed to be made, right? Okay, we're not this issue by issue, month after month thing where we milk the same old characters over and over again is not sustainable. Eventually, it's going to have to become about higher page count, higher quality, larger deluxe format. And, he couldn't have foreseen the digital,
Yeah.
revolution that was coming around the pike, but it goes hand in hand with that, right? Those two planks, it's clear what the formula is now. Music! For Christ's sake, the music industry has started to figure it out, and the comic industry still hasn't. That the only way forward is to, yes, continue making physical, but make physical deluxe. Make the
Yes.
physical something beautiful that you want on your shelf that you couldn't get anywhere else. And meanwhile, for most people, here's the readily available, very cheap, very portable digital version. And
Yep.
if you like it a lot, maybe you'll grab the physical too. Who knows, right? He knew that all the way back then, and somehow they did not future-proof themselves.
Yeah. Well, that's that's something that I've thought about. The previous interview was with a DJ musician, and he does. He basically does all digital distribution on everything, right? And he puts out a lot of his work, basically everything for free. But he also sells vinyls, and I always think it's kind of interesting how it's basically like, all right, well, we're going to go with the highest tech and the lowest tech in a way, and it's because with the lowest tech version you get a sort of authenticity. There is something about vinyl, and I'm
Well, and if you're gonna go deluxe physical format, now I prefer CDs, I always have, but if you're gonna go deluxe physical format, what's more deluxe than a giant photograph of
exactly.
the album cover and a big gatefold and maybe some extra stuff in the liners? Like, of course, you can put a poster in there easy.
Mm-hmm.
It's so natural as a pairing, right? So I completely understand. Vinyl is not as practical, and I mean, it sounds okay, but I don't think it's a warm sound. Like, I'm not into that. I'm sorry. I've been in bands. I've recorded albums. It's a bunch of bullshit. It sounds fine. I like vinyl. I have lots of vinyl. I think it's a great format. But like CD is the best of both worlds.
Yeah, until you scratch it. I tell you what. Anyway, never mind. I don't want to go too far down that hole. But I've had a great time talking to you, and I will go ahead and let you get back to what you're doing. But before you go, do you have any message for the IronAge fans and authors out there who might be tuning in? Any kind of, I know you're known for your inspirational quotes and warm fuzzy diatribes.
Right. No. I mean, look, guys, I think it's pretty obvious at this point that the initial kind of we've long since left the post-orgasmal afterglow of superhero trends in the films and such. I said on Twitter recently, we have officially entered the fat Elvis phase of the superhero trend. And folks, somebody's got to pick up the bit. And there's a vacuum. There is a yawning chasm where people are wanting tales of genuine heroism. Not even genuine heroism. You don't even corral yourself that far. They're looking for direct storytelling with not necessarily a viewpoint, but a strong moral center that has that kind of, it has a core to it. It's not just disposable fast food trash. Not that there's anything wrong with fast food fiction, but at the end of the day, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for something that's actually going to grab them by the balls and say, read me. Like this is the story that you need to know about. And that's the thing. Like, I feel like as important as it is to get those written, like I said earlier, it's arguably more important to have people talking about it, to have a new guys. The law of averages being what it is, not everybody can write or draw. That's just how it is. AI art may arguably help some people in that regard, even though it's basically taking all the most vacuous elements of digital and removing that pesky talent from the equation. It's no good. But for some people, eventually maybe that'll be an option. But at the end of the day, guys, you have an opportunity to build something even better. And that is you're about to create a community. Like you guys are ready to actually launch something that is going to last much longer than anybody's creation, anybody's comic, anybody's pulp, anybody, whatever. I mean, it's incredibly exciting to me because this is going to happen whether I give the encouraging, speech at the end of Rudy or not. Like it doesn't matter. This is happening. This zeitgeist is here. It's here to stay. And I called it the Iron Age for one simple reason. It may not have the luster of gold or silver, but we hammer it the fuck out. And that goes for the people who are going to talk about this stuff, for the people who are going to be passionate about it, are going to cover it. I mean, I'm just excited as hell about not just your website, but the fact that there's now people who are genuinely identifying with this Iron Age movement. I claim no ownership of it, by the way. It's just a name. I think it was just a phenomenon that required a label. And I'm excited as hell to see that other people are smelling what's cooking in the air. Like there's just a scent there. And my olfactories are well attuned to the scent of fucking badass. And boy, it is coming. It is coming. I am excited.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you joining us.